Hi, my name is Elizabeth Lokenauth, and this presentation will be the 2016 Business versus General Press Agenda Study, Coca-Cola in India. This research project involves a light analysis of news and media agendas in India, with a focus on the reputation of Coca-Cola in the news. I will draw on media in India through the Factiva database as well as possible online news sources in order to discuss the differences between the newspapers and why I've found these differences. I have put together a sample of news over time, one focusing on 2010 through 2015 and the other directed towards the first quarter of 2016. What I found was that variation derives from the amount of stories being published. High state coverage and other factors help to explain the large visibility of the company. My intention initially was to look at Coca-Cola, given the reputational groundwater issue in India, and I wanted to look across just beyond one newspaper. I had started the process of coding 4 different newspapers: the Economic Times, the Times of India, the Business Line, and the Hindu, over the last 6 years. However, I decided that it would just be too much data to handle for the purposes of this project. But I've decided to take a different approach. What we see in the first quarter are longer-standing issues. For instance, the groundwater issue is persisting. So, the new plan of action is to discuss 2016 trends in the 4 newspapers mentioned. This will be a qualitative analysis of the last 4 months. I'll be covering why stories in the business press and the general press are different, as well as a few key characteristics. My research question states, what characteristics help to explain the variation across business press and general press newspapers? From the Factiva data, I found that looking at the specific regions where the stories derive from help to explain the variation, coupled with the subject matter, the amount of stories that are being published during the exam time frame, and depending on which state is getting the most coverage, sort of helps to explain the large visibility of Coca-Cola as a brand. I will now give an overview on how one can conduct a reputation analysis. Essentially, you'd have to code for tone and topic when considering conducting a reputation analysis on a large visibility brand such as Coca-Cola. When I began coding, I started reading about approximately 20 business line articles just to get a generalization of what was happening. And the things that I looked for were the date, the newspaper, the word count, what type of story it was, whether a story was considered to be news, which explains an event that occurred within the last 24 hours, whether it was an analysis, which describes expectations, motives, and why something is happening. What is the plan of action that the brand has come up with in terms of looking ahead, and also op-eds, which are opinion-based pieces. I also coded for tone. -2 is most negative, 0 is neutral, and 2 is most positive. Then I read through each article to see if Coke's rival company, Pepsi, had been mentioned, and I recorded that citing with 0 and 1. Evidently, what I found was that most of the pieces were considered to be analysis-type stories, coded as 2, which is expected from the business press. Also, over the 6 years, what can be seen from the Factiva chart is that there were 182 stories on Coca-Cola in India. Looking at this business line example, the year 2013 generated the most articles published on Coca-Cola in India, depending on if the headline and lead paragraph were restricted in the search, or if it was the basis of the main subject in the article. What I saw was that most of the articles were generally positive and did not mention Pepsi, only for the exception of 3 times. Looking at Coca-Cola from 2010 through 2015, through the 6-year index, the Economic Times has written the most articles on Coca-Cola. For full article searches, the Economic Times garnered 1,023 results. The Hindu Business Line had 500, the Times of India had 593, and the Hindu had 805 stories. For headline and lead paragraph searches, the Economic Times had 376 results, the Hindu Business Line had 182, the Times of India had 255, and the Hindu had 423 results. In looking over these numbers, it is evident that depending on what search term you are using, you will find that the numbers vary between full article and headline lead paragraph. Interestingly, the Hindu had the highest number in headline and lead paragraph, where the Hindu Business Line had the least, 182. One would think that the business press would lead the headline and lead paragraph search, but it is the general press that had the highest number of headline and lead paragraph results. For the first quarter of 2016, there haven't been an abundance of articles published on Coca-Cola. However, in examining the numbers, the Economic Times got 50 results, the Business Line found 36, the Times of India saw 31, and the Hindu garnered 22 hits for full articles. As for headline and lead paragraph statistics, the Economic Times had 24 results, the Business Line had 16, the Times of India had 14, and the Hindu had only 9. What can be said about these results is that, so far, the business press is leading the stories on Coca-Cola as the brand continues to expand in various ways. For the Times of India, I am just going to mention some of the 2016 trends. As we can see, February had the most documents distributed. Regarding subjects covered, most were categorized as corporate, industrial news, domestic regional politics, as well as nutrition. The most mentioned regions were Maharashtra, Mumbai, Australia, and Delhi over the last 4 months. I also thought it was interesting to mention the keywords that were found in the 31 published Times of India stories. So, as Coca-Cola is a soft drink company, it is of no surprise that the word beverage appears. Largest business is also super interesting because it's a pretty large brand in terms of visibility. For 2016 trends in the Hindu, Kerala is the most mentioned region in this newspaper. Why? Well, the most mentioned subjects were political general news, domestic politics, civil disruption, regional politics, and plans versus strategies. The most mentioned regions were Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, and so forth. If the keywords are an indication of anything, it's pretty clear that a lot of the stories have to deal with environmental issues, location of Coca-Cola plants, potential new hubs, and company strategies. To provide an overview of the Times of India versus the Hindu, here are a few headlines that I have laid out with the date and regions. The Times of India generally posts a higher amount of news, and most are positive stories on Coca-Cola. Also, the Hindu has mostly positive stories as well. These are the 4 top regions for each newspaper respectively. As for 2016 trends in the Economic Times, it is obviously associated with the business press, so we see a lot of food, drink related stories because after all, Coca-Cola is a huge invisible brand. We see corporate sponsorship, advertising, marketing, corporate, branding, and strategy as the most mentioned subjects. Some of the keywords that appear within the 50 stories published thus far this year range from marketing, demand, and approaches. For the business line in 2016, there have been 36 stories posted so far. Branding, advertising, PR marketing, plans, and strategy were the most mentioned subjects. As you can see, Haryana was the most mentioned region amongst the rest that are listed. The important keywords that can be found are people, strategy, business, crisis, brand, and services. Here again, I've created a table that just previews a few headlines to get a better understanding of how these newspapers portray Coca-Cola. For the Economic Times versus the Business Line, I've listed the top regions, and what I found while reading through the headlines is that most of these stories were considered to be corporate industrial stories, as the Economic Times and Business Line fall under the business press. To conclude, here are some key takeaways. Within the first quarter of these published stories, there are still some longer-standing issues that will take quite some time to solve. Overall, the stories range from negative, neutral, and positive. We can't necessarily say that one specific newspaper portrays Coca-Cola in a certain way, but if we look at the business press, it's portrayed to be generally positive because it's an enterprise, where mainly corporate, branding, and marketing stories are covered. And considering this from a general press standpoint, it's more about general and domestic issues. So if you were to read about the groundwater story, for instance, that would appear to be negative because it's a controversial issue for the brand and makes them look as if they are committing an act of unregulated water usage. But then again, it really depends on the press type, as well as the specific characteristics that help to explain the variations across both press types. Hope you've enjoyed.